Nearly 22 months after Russia invaded, Ukraine's much-heralded counteroffensive has failed to deliver the breakthrough that Kyiv expected. Claiming that Russian forces are improving their positions, Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, is dispatching more soldiers, weapons, and munitions to the battlefield. Ukrainian forces and citizens are bracing for another tough winter. With U.S. support hanging in the balance, President Zelensky warns Ukraine could lose without U.S. help. Meanwhile, Russia has launched a diplomatic offensive in the global south and a hybrid attack on the west. Our question today, Russia's war on Ukraine, will Putin get what he wants? And it is a pleasure to welcome our guests here on To The Point. Wilfried Jilge is an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP. He's an expert on Eastern Europe and a mediation advisor on Ukraine at the Center for International Peace Operations. Great to have you with us. And Moritz Gattmann reports from Eastern Europe and currently Ukraine for the German news magazine Stern. And finally, we're very pleased to welcome from London, Irina Borogan. She is a Russian investigative journalist, co-founder and deputy editor of agentura.ru, a watchdog of the Russian Secret Services activities. Great to have you with us, Irina. And Moritz, we're hearing the word stalemate mentioned more and more these days. Do you think that term is justified? Is this conflict edging toward something that you could call a frozen conflict?
Well, a frozen conflict would be a front line where you don't have shooting anymore. But that's definitely not the case at the moment. What we see basically since last November, so 2022, is an attrition war. Basically, you don't have a big movement of the front line anymore. Neither of the sides can conquer any big cities or territories. But it's an attrition war. From trenches to trenches, the use of drones is very important at the moment. It's becoming more and more important, makes the battle bloodier even more. And yeah, it's an attrition war with thousands of victims every month. And actually, at this moment, no end in sight.
And can I just ask you, because I know you have been reporting from Ukraine, Wilfried has also recently been there, but the counteroffensive, there were high expectations of it. Has it delivered any gains at all, Ukraine's counteroffensive?
Unfortunately, concerning the front line, there haven't been a lot of gains. Ukraine has gained some square kilometers, some square miles, but the big aim to push through to the Azov Sea hasn't been reached. And of course, also because of these big expectations, I mean, Zelensky at the beginning of the year talked about a year of victory. And this is why inside Ukraine, the frustration is also very big.
And Irina, if I can go to you, Vladimir Putin has been looking and sounding pretty confident lately. Should he be? How well assured is support at home?
It's not an easy question because, you know, and Russia is an authoritarian regime, and under authoritarian regime, people are not free to express themselves, and especially nowadays in Russia, people are frightened all the time and they can't express themselves freely. But the last polls shows us that the main questions that Russian people want to ask Putin is when the war will end. So it means that his support a little bit. There is not a lot of people who are pro-war, and the Putin support in terms of continuing war is not so strong as it used to be.
And Russia's pouring a tremendous amount of resources into this war effort. How long can it sustain that? As long as it needs to?
To be honest, all a lot of analysts, many of them, including me, failed to predict how strong the Putin regime is and how good his economy is doing. So far, the economy is still doing quite well, and there are a lot of resources, still a lot of resources that Putin can spend on the war. He was successful to solidify all resources into military-industrial complex, and Russian military-industrial complex is much stronger than it used to be 2 years ago. So let's see how it will go. But I think that he still has at least 6 or 8 months without any problem ahead.
Wilfried, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently said that the West should be prepared for bad news from Ukraine, I'm quoting here, and he seemed to discount the current standoff, saying that wars go up and down, they have good and bad phases.
Yes, that's of course true, and the problem is how long the war goes bad for Ukraine. That is a problem, but it's also a problem for Russia. We should be clear, because not everything is very nice in Russia. In the long term, also Putin knows that the collective West is, if he is really willing to support Ukraine for a longer time, has a superiority in technology and also in financing. That's clear. And that is actually the case because why Russia is now launching that hybrid media campaign also in the global south, to give the impression we are mighty, we can do everything, and to bring uncertainty and intimidation into the Western societies.
So let me ask you about that, and we will come back to that global south outreach that he's been doing.
By the way, global south, I don't like that word.
I know, nobody
absolutely
does, but
it's
everybody seems to use it. So, but let me first ask you, in regard to what Stoltenberg has said, he basically went on to say in the same statement that we should be prepared to support Ukraine in both good and bad times. But are we? The U.S., the Senate, has just torpedoed a $1 billion aid package for Ukraine. And, there's doubt about the degree to which the U.S., the biggest supporter, will be willing to maintain that support.
Yes, of course. And of course, what I said is only true if the West is really ready to support Ukraine for a longer time. And it's not only because of liberating Crimea and so what, it is to defend Ukraine also simply. The problem is, I think, that we still do not know what is the outcome in the fights in the US. Because we still have many Republicans who are very willing to counteract against Russia, against Putin's Russia. So I think that is also part of a bargaining, but it is, of course, it makes the Ukrainians uncertain. That is a problem. And the second problem is, what I see in Europe, yes, we scaled up our support. Yes, we already achieved very much. For example, Germany now is the second deliverer of weapons, what's very interesting. However, we are not on the way that we really will have an important visible share which can compete with the US in order to convince these Republicans that it is worth continuing to support the war in Europe.
Let's pick up on that point in a moment, but I would like to take a closer look first at the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. The U.S. Defense Secretary recently said that Russia has been badly weakened by the war, but at least for now, that weakness is not readily apparent at the front lines.
An increasing amount of weapons and more soldiers. Russian President Putin wants to increase the number of troops in the Russian armed forces by 170,000 people to a total of 1.3 million. At the beginning of the second winter of the war, Russia remains strong. We are now fighting not just for Russia's freedom, but for the freedom of the whole world. It is our country that is now at the forefront of building a fairer world order. Without a sovereign, strong Russia, no lasting, stable world order is possible. To accomplish this, Putin also accepts high losses. His soldiers withstood the Ukrainian counteroffensive and even went on the counterattack. Like in Avdiivka, the Russian army never seems to run out of ammunition. Their successful battle plans also include the increased use of drones and electronic warfare. On top of that, cyber attacks, using refugees as a means of exerting pressure and propaganda. Putin's hybrid war strategy is working, despite international condemnation and sanctions. Is Russia getting stronger?
And let me put that question to Moritz, and perhaps also ask you to talk about how we are seeing that in conjunction with the battle for Avdiivka. It's both sides have been sustaining very, very heavy losses there. The Ukrainian government says its soldiers are standing their ground. Is that your assessment?
They are standing their ground, but especially Ukraine has more and more problems to get more soldiers, to recruit more soldiers inside the country, because the people see what kind of war it is at the moment, and you don't want to get a one-way ticket into the trenches of Bakhmut, of course, if you're a man in Ukraine today. So what I would say is what we need after these 21 months of war is a realistic approach. A realistic approach that doesn't underestimate the enemy, Russia, but that also doesn't overestimate what Ukraine can reach and what we can do for Ukraine. And I have the feeling that especially the last year, 2023, showed especially these problems, that we also overestimated Ukraine. We were thinking that it could win the war in this year, but Ukraine itself, they also overestimated what they could do, and we underestimated Russia. So this is what those are the key findings that I would get from this year.
Wilfried, realistic approach, would you agree?
Yes, but the realistic approach means also to differentiate why Russia maybe has a momentum. I do not think that they in quality really became stronger at the moment, but that can happen if we would not change strategically our support for Ukraine. You see, for example, in Avdiivka that there is, of course, much more losses on the Russian side. That is clear. We have, and of course there are losses, and I absolutely agree with Mr. Gartman. Ukrainian soldiers became exhausted. That is a big problem, of course, but they are still not ready to give up. That is also very clear also in society. But what we should see is, yes, Russia now has more munition, but excuse me, they ran out of munition. They had big problems several times ago. Actually, with artillery munition, they still have big problems with mechanized brigades. Look who is going to Avdiivka. It's only infantry. People go on foot to the front lines, not supported by bigger mechanized brigades. So what I only want to say is we need realism on both sides. And we have to formulate such aims which are realistic also when it comes to offensive and also when it comes to defense, in order to make really successes which bring Ukraine in a better position and bring dynamics in the favor of Ukraine.
So let me go over to Irina and ask you about the real situation for Russian forces. The U.S. National Security Council recently said that Russia's heavy losses at Avdiivka are depressing the Russian troops' morale, and they claimed that Russian commanders were threatening to execute entire units if they retreated from Ukrainian artillery fire. Can you tell us whether that is true, that claim, and what the mood is amongst the Russian forces?
I don't know whether it's true or not, but you know that in the Russian past, in the Soviet Union, they used these methods, and I mean, these methods, they were successful, and at least in the totalitarian state. But now, I don't think that the current war is the World War II, so harsh methods could be successful to some extent, but you can't use it every day. But to me, so far, Putin's position and the Russians' position on the front line seems kind of strong. I'm very sorry to say this, but they have a lot of resources, including people resources. And the difference between the West and Russia is that the West is usually care about their soldiers, about their people, about their human resources, but Russia does not. The Kremlin don't pay a lot of attention how many people it sacrificed in the battlefield. And it seems that the Russian public doesn't care a lot too. So that's the difference.
And we'll come back to the way the Russian public sees it. But Wilfried, let me ask you this. This conflict has become a war of attrition, as Moritz said in his first answer earlier. Does that automatically give Russia, with its size and its resources, the advantage? And how long can Russia sustain the kind of spending that it's doing? If you count national security and police, Russia actually is heading towards spending 10% of its GDP. Is that sustainable?
I think it is sustainable in a certain time, for a certain period, but not automatically for a long time. And that is actually why Russia now is launching these campaigns, because they know if the West will decide for more support, technology and financing of Ukraine, they know that in the long run, Russia is weaker than the West. Not, of course, weaker than Ukraine. You have to be clear here. Yes, of course, Russia, when it comes to personnel, when it comes to resources, is more mighty than Ukraine. But not if European and US will backing Ukraine for a longer time. That's the first thing. And let me make a little remark on that war of attrition. That is not completely true. We should nevertheless take also a deeper look on the front lines. And we see, of course, that Ukrainians manage to go through the Surovikin line on certain points. The problem is Ukraine has not the support of aircraft, and Russia has a full superiority in the air over the occupied territories. And that is a problem, but that problem can be resolved in the next time better, much more better for Ukraine. The second point is, please do not forget that Ukraine achieved to reopen the humanitarian corridor for the grain export and for other export of goods of Ukraine, which is very important because they could push back very much the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and they could really substantially harm the Russian facilities on the sea.
Moritz, one question, and then I want to shift our focus to the diplomatic side. But Russia is not only ramping up production of military hardware and ammunition, it is also investing massively in drones and recently launched the biggest drone strike since the invasion began. Very briefly, if you would, what effect is that having on operations on the ground?
Well, I mean, of course, we see more drones attacking Ukrainian cities, but I would say that Ukrainian air defense is coping quite well with that. But more important is the drone warfare over the trenches. It turns the front line into a kill zone where basically soldiers can't get out of their trenches without getting killed.
And there's another important factor. If you need Gepard for drones, you don't have Gepard. You don't have Gepard on the front to protect your tanks, which should go forward.
Yeah. Thank you. Irina, so let's move on to talk about the role of diplomacy in all of this. The quote from Putin that we heard in our report just now was part of a speech in which he depicted Russia as a champion pushing back against the hegemonic West. How many countries of the global South are actually buying into this message? And what does that mean for Russia's war effort?
I don't think that's a lot of countries really buying this thing, but because the African countries are extremely poor, as they need money, they need investments, and Russia are ready to provide this support to some African countries. And because a lot of African regimes, they need security. And, you know, Wagner, the Russian private military company provides some African regimes with security and with protection. So that's why Putin's and the Kremlin narratives is working in the African countries. But, I mean, they don't buy this. They just need his support and his money. I think it's partly true for the Latin American countries. So, and huge anti-Americanism, which is driven in this country for some very genuine reasons, also is very helpful here.
Moritz, Putin has just made a rare and very quick trip to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and he declared that relations with the Emirates are at an all-time high, as he said. Does that have anything to do with the fact that numerous Russian companies have now made UAE their temporary base and are using it essentially to evade Western sanctions?
Well, I think we're getting to a point where we have to admit that if you want a more realistic approach, that the power of the West is very limited. We thought at the beginning of this conflict that our sanctions could lead to the fall of Russia somehow. But we have to admit, 21 months after the beginning of the war, that actually there are a lot of countries in the world who maybe they are not Russia-friendly, but they tell the West, this is not our conflict. We want to stay out of this. We don't want to get any negative impact from this on our economies. We will cooperate with everyone. And this is a very different situation maybe from 20 or 25 years ago.
Yes, but however, I do not fully agree with it. Please take the facts. Look at the summit with the so-called Global South in Moscow, the African summit. Many state leaders did not come as they did in the former years. So it was quite disappointing. And what you also see is that when we now speak with Brazil and South America about the Mercosur agreement, that is actually what the West still has the potential to do, also with India, to give them something concrete, substantial, and to say, okay, if we make that agreement, we can, for example, also speak by some. You need not to take the sanction regime, but please keep to some rules. So we need much more diplomatic investment, because what Putin declares about the Global South, that is only a part, is a realistic result, and the other thing is propaganda.
Moritz, when we look at support or lack thereof from the West, what difference do you think that the war in Gaza is making? Is it diverting Western attention and potentially also resources at this very critical moment when Ukraine most needs them?
Of course, the attention is a very important resource. And what we saw, of course, since the beginning of the Gaza war is that the attention is going away from Ukraine, also because of the fact that from Ukraine you don't have so many good news at the moment. And yeah, of course, the attention is distracted from Ukraine, but also I would say that the Gaza war is a moral problem for the West, because you have a situation where Israel is bombing the Gaza Strip. There are heavy civilian casualties. And of course, in many countries of the world, whom we told over the last 2 years that Russia is bad and morally bad, they ask now, okay, what is Israel doing at the moment? So morally, this war is also a big problem for the West.
Joe Biden said when the Senate defeated the aid package for Ukraine that it could certainly become a big problem for the U.S. as well, saying that it could be that we see American soldiers fighting Russian soldiers if the U.S. ceases to provide support. Wilfried, do you think that will change any minds?
If Russia...
Joe Biden says that if the U.S. continues to deny additional support to Ukraine, it well could be that Putin will get what he wants and that the U.S. could wind up fighting Russia.
I think that is actually what we should understand, yes, that if we do not support now Ukraine, it is also a problem for our security, for the American security. And by the way, it's also important for the Republicans, because if you want really to counteract China, you also need to contain China's instrument in Europe. That's important. And on the Gaza, very important. It's also about geopolitics. Please do not forget that Putin has a concrete interest in his bases in the Near East. That's also very important.
I'm going to not go there because we have very little time left on the clock. And I would very briefly like to come back to the point about morale that you made earlier, Irina. How do people in Russia, and especially mothers in Russia, see the prospect of this conflict continuing? We've seen mothers demonstrating in Ukraine and isolated demonstrations in Russia itself. How high is the dissatisfaction there?
I can say that dissatisfaction in Russia is not very huge, because Putin, for the last months, Putin was successful to recruit mostly people for money, contractors. So mobilization stopped for a while, and people were very happy with that. And so far he's fine with contractors, people who are fighting for money. So their family are satisfied with this money, and that's why we don't have a lot of protests against the war.
And Moritz, those protests in Ukraine itself, could they undermine the war effort? One sentence.
Of course, if the war continues in this attrition mode, this problem will get even worse.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Thank you out there for tuning in.